The Electoral College is a very confusing institution for those not well versed in American politics. Even for those who are politically active, the Electoral College can seem stupid, unnecessary, and undemocratic. And those people are right. The Electoral College should have no place in modern American elections, and in this video I'm going to explain why. The Electoral College was enshrined in the Constitution as a sort of compromise. A number of the Founding Fathers deeply distrusted the wisdom of voters, and so the Electoral College was created. It allowed the voters, who at first were just landowning white men, to vote for a set of electors, who would then serve as representatives to the Electoral College, which actually chose the next president. The Electoral College did give people a say in who would become president, as very rarely do electors not vote according to their affiliations. However, it ultimately leaves the decision to a group of elites. There are two important things to note about the time period when the Electoral College was established. In the late 1700s, there was not widespread access to information at all. Even though literacy among Americans was likely higher than in Europe, the average American in 1787 obviously could not obtain a fraction of the information that modern Americans can. The second important thing to keep in mind is that information traveled incredibly slowly in this time. It could take days for a vote cast in Georgia to be counted in Washington. So we can understand why the Electoral College came to be. Voters weren't trusted, and access to information was sparse, and that information traveled slowly. As well, it was a way for states to retain a good deal of power in federal governance. Another way in which they did this was by appointing their own senators rather than holding elections as they do today. But none of this tells us if the Electoral College should still be used today. There are a number of arguments that people use to justify still using the Electoral College, so I'm going to address them and explain why abolishing the Electoral College is the biggest no-brainer in American politics. The most common argument that people use to support the Electoral College is that it prevents candidates from campaigning exclusively in America's largest cities. They say that the Electoral College ensures that candidates for president visit rural areas across the country because they need support in as many states as possible. With the popular vote system, they say that rural America would be voiceless, totally drowned out by the cities. What this argument doesn't consider, though, is that the Electoral College itself ensures that millions of Americans don't have their voices properly heard. Over the last 5 presidential elections, 38 states, including Washington, D.C., voted for the same party each time. This means that in the vast majority of states, voters in the minority have essentially zero influence on the outcome. A few of those states, like Arizona, do have the potential to flip in 2020. But this is the exception. For the most part, they can all be expected to vote the same way they have since 2000, and by comfortable margins. Given that all but 2 states are winner-take-all, a vote for a Republican in a solid blue state is worthless and nullified by the outcome. So why would a Democratic candidate ever appeal to concerns of Americans who live in Alabama? Why would a Republican ever step foot in Oregon? While many people claim that a popular vote system ensures that many Americans are voiceless and effectively disenfranchised, it is actually the Electoral College which does this to a much worse effect. Mathematically, power is spread very unevenly under the Electoral College. Because of how electors are apportioned, votes cast in the most populous states are less impactful than votes cast in the least populous ones. One electoral vote from California represents 3 times as many citizens as does one electoral vote from Wyoming, which gives Wyoming voters 3 times as much power as their Californian counterparts. And while a popular vote system would give cities a great amount of power, is there anything inherently wrong with this? The reason that cities would have a great deal of influence is because they should. But it's not the cities themselves that hold this influence, but the millions of individuals who live within them. New York City should matter a great deal to a presidential election because of how many people live there, and in both the Electoral College and popular vote systems it would. Currently, New York City anchors the Democratic Party's hold on the state and the 29 electoral votes that go with it. This means that any Republican votes cast in New York City and the state as a whole are worthless. Under a popular vote system, this would not be the case. No matter how blue New York gets, every Republican vote cast there would still count. Every Democratic vote in Mississippi would count. No matter where any voter lives, their vote would count the exact same as anywhere else. Under the Electoral College, a Democratic candidate would hardly be justified in spending time campaigning in the South. The candidate could receive 20, 30, or 40% of the vote in those states, and it wouldn't matter in the slightest to the broader outcome. However, under a popular vote system, a Democratic candidate would campaign much more in the South, because no matter how red those states get, every vote would still matter. A candidate gaining, for example, 10% support in the South, raising their numbers from 30 to 40%, would actually help that candidate in the race, so it would be worthwhile to campaign there. Another huge issue that we currently have with our presidential elections is that it's essentially 51 separate elections. But since the presidential election affects every person in this country, it's silly to have 51 separate elections to influence a singular outcome. So along with transitioning to popular vote, we should also make all laws relating to the presidential election federal. So I've just laid out a detailed case for why we need to get rid of the Electoral College. But honestly, I didn't really need to do that. There is one basic, obvious reason for why we need to get rid of the Electoral College that in itself trumps all arguments in support of it. It is undemocratic, period. In 2 of the last 4 presidential elections, the candidate that received the most votes lost. Now, I'm not going to use this as an excuse for Hillary Clinton losing the election, because she doesn't deserve one. She and the DNC screwed over Bernie Sanders in the primaries, and in the general, she knew the rules of the game she was playing, and she lost. But any person who tries to convince you that such blatant, undemocratic outcomes are justified is fooling themselves. Many people, especially on the right, tie themselves in knots trying to justify undemocratic outcomes with nonsense arguments like tyranny of the majority. We prevent tyranny of the majority by ensuring things like universal rights and access to public goods. Preventing tyranny of the majority does not mean that the most important office in the world should be occupied by the person who got fewer votes. Getting rid of the Electoral College does leave a hole that must be filled. While I've been referring to a popular vote system, there's not one way to do it. I personally favor a ranked choice voting system because it allows more than 2 candidates to run without acting as quote-unquote spoilers. It would give voters the freedom to vote for the candidate they truly support without sacrificing their vote to a candidate with very little chance of winning. I encourage you to learn more about it. So I hope you enjoyed the video. That's it for today. I'm Eitan Magalif.